That's
All
fun.
right. All right. We are live. It is Dr. Observability. Perry. Perry. How you doing today? Now it's Ed Cribbles, Ed Bailey. We're here.
I'm
We're
do
going to talk observability.
I'm doing great. I'm doing great today, Ed. And as you know, I'm putting together this whole series on observability. And I was going through Ed, and we're going to cover this topic and this topic and this topic. And one of the things that Ed brought up is, I guess you're kind of missing the whole point of why even bother going. What is the value of observability? And a lot of times you read books and papers and all this stuff, and it's all about technology. It's all about what it can do for you or promises. But you know, kind of back up a minute, and it's like, why are we even doing this? Why are we even going there? And I think that would be a great opportunity to kind of for Ed and I just kind of talk that over a little bit.
I completely agree. So tell me, how are things in Chattanooga? How's the weather?
Chattanooga is great. We're actually moving into fall now, so getting some nice. The nights are getting in low 60s, upper 50s, and the days are 70s to 80s. So it's like the perfect time of year to be here.
Nice. Yeah, it's rainy and kind of it's getting cooler in Atlanta too. Gosh, I just got back from a trip and I thought 90 minutes would be enough to go 22 miles from the airport to my house. You know what? It was not enough. You can always
Hey,
count on the connector to be chaotic.
I've been. Don't even talk to me about going through Atlanta because I can. You're only about 2 hours from me, but I can get 80% of the way there in an hour, and the last and the last 20 it becomes the other hour. So
Oh, it sure does. It sure does. Goodness. But I am glad we're here today to talk. I think this is a common conversation. And this is also where I think is a big source of confusion in the security, the monitoring, logging. And it's like, what the hell is observability and why do I care? And because I think that's the thing is those you have to answer those fundamental questions because I see companies, diving into, yeah, we're observability, but haven't answered the questions of, you know, what is it? Why does it matter to the business? Because ultimately, why does it matter to the business? What and what are the origins of it, and also the many kind of offshoots of it. So I mean, I think this is a great foundational place to start because I'm really intrigued. I think your series is a great idea. So I think this is something I'm really looking forward to.
what to me is very funny. I did an observability, the basics of observability a couple years ago, and I did a bunch of research. I like to read as much as I can, and I came across this study, and it was really funny. It was like 60, 70%, think observability is really, really important, and 60, 70% of those who have observability is saying like it's very, very valuable to our company. And then at the bottom of this stuff, this document, this study, it was like 65 to 70% aren't really sure what it is. So everybody wants it. Everybody thinks it's a great idea. And I think one of the parts of that, or one of the justifications for that, I guess a good way to say is that it's not defined anywhere. So it's not like there's not an IEEE or an ISO doc that says, this is what observability is. So it's like I don't want to actually say it's anything you want, but nobody can accuse you from being wrong because it's like just you said it's just kind of this nebulous type thing. I need to know more.
I think in the right circles, it's well understood what it is, and there's a practice behind it. I mean, there's actually some scientific theory, especially in game theory, about it. But all those little nuances are not well understood. So, how about I bring up your deck and we'll kind of go through it.
Oh, absolutely. And one of the reasons that Ed and I are on this today is because I've got about 30 years of networking experience. That's why we both got beards and gray hair and less type stuff. But on the vendor side, basically on the creator side, and Ed's always kind of sitting on the other side of the table, so to speak. He's got all his equivalent experience, but it's more on the consumer, on the customer side of it. And I
Right.
think kind of where we come from is kind of a neat mix because I go back and I hate to say this to the Ethernet token ring days, and I remember the first the first steps down the observability path were, the IETF's SNMP type stuff, start gathering information. And then the ISO got in with something called FCAPS, which I really me gives a little bit of credit to that to where we are with observability today. Now, FCAP stood for fault configuration, accounting, performance, and security. And it was kind of the idea, how do I gather all this stuff from different systems, from different vendors to try to give me a little bit of information? And that's kind of where I came from. And where'd you come from, Ed? What did you start with? I mean, I remember I started networking with Banyan Vines, which is scary that how far back that goes.
Wow. That's that. Wow. Yeah. I mean, I heard about Bandy Vines. I've never actually seen it. So yeah, that shows our age a little bit. Yeah, I started out a lot working in home stuff. I first started out in legal technology, which is, by the way, a little frightening. Um, I think, you always want to be careful. I think every lawyer is an expert in everything, so you always that was interesting. But then branched out, and I think the big thing I really had my best place to start learning was working at the University of Florida. You're talking about working with everything, a little bit of everything. I'll never forget finding a lab that had a fancy scientific instrument and had a control box. I'm like, what the hell is this? And then it broke, and then they asked me to try to fix it. It was Solaris 1.0. I
Wow.
mean, it was like, it was like finding the Holy Grail. I mean, I took this thing over to I called the nerds over at the computer science department, and they all came running over because they wanted to see what Solaris 1.0 looked like. And I had an open VAX cluster. I mean, I had all these silicon graphic stuff. I mean, it was insane, just the variety and token ring network stuff. I got to replace that too. So you get to learn the foundational aspects of it, let me tell you.
No, that was pretty good, and it was challenging back then
Yeah.
because, which way was it gonna go and all that stuff, and that's why it was kind of a good idea to have a centralized system of way to manage all this stuff.
Hmm.
So once again, this is kind of where we're getting to today, and if you want to kind of go to the next slide,
Yeah,
um,
totally. And that's where I think it's important to start establishing these, foundational elements.
this is us. Um, and we can go to the next one.
There we go.
And
Yeah.
this is where
All
it
right.
starts getting fun,
Right.
because you got a lot of stuff, and not necessarily we're going to go through every one of these, but these are kind of points that you can discuss about. And I'm going to throw it at you right now because you're the one who forced me to do this, or forced is the wrong way. You're the one who said, "Hey, Perry, it's a good idea to kind of figure out where you're going from first." So, what
I
is the
provided
business?
encouragement.
What is the business value for observability? I mean,
Well,
why even get in this journey?
all right. So let's start a little bit about what is observability at the fundamental, because people get monitoring and observability confused. Typically, you're looking at monitoring as we're looking at a stream of data. We're looking for error messages. We're looking for a number. We're looking for three critical error messages in a 1 minute window, and we're going to have an alert. Looking for. I think the best way I heard charity majors at describe it was you have you're looking for static known failure scenarios. The problem with most monitoring setups is you're constantly chasing your tail because when something that you've never come across before happens, you miss it. And so because everything you're monitoring for what you know about, you're not monitoring for what you don't know about. And so
That's a
there's always
good point.
shortcomings.
No,
Go ahead.
that's a good point because
Yeah.
I've read different things, and as you said, I've seen monitoring described as you're looking for known things on an instrumented system that
Exactly.
and whereas observability, it's kind of like I don't want to actually say it's monitored as almost like watching for events and logs. Whereas once you get into observability, I don't want to say it's traces, but I'm looking at a much larger environment. I'm not just looking at one thing that happened. I'm looking at what impacted what impacted what.
And so much of that's and so in the game theory aspect of it was the idea that you're looking for your unknown unknowns, and then how you find your unknown unknowns, which is a mouthful of marbles, is the idea that you want to be able to understand system behavior. And so instead of looking for error messages, you're looking at how the system behaves. And like, just to give you a little bit of my own example, um, one of the big benefits of Cribble, I was finally able to free up my team to do things that were more interesting, especially on analytics. And we kind of fell in the idea of anomaly detection. So we had this huge project with all these data scientists, and like we're going to do this guided machine learning, and they'd been at it for months with their applications, and they just couldn't figure it out. So I had my team, because we all knew our systems, we knew Splunk really well, that we were able to then start doing baseline and anomaly detection. So we're looking at the system behavior. So we're seeing, for example, just we started with 3 or 4 golden signals. The idea is that you pick a particular application, you're looking to try to understand what's normal. And the thing is, we are going to then trigger alerts based on what's abnormal. And so that way, abnormality can be anything. And so we're not, and we're going to find those unknown unknowns because We're looking at things that actually affect system performance. So one of the things we found, for example, is our old alert about this particular error message, of looking at 3 error messages in a 1 minute window as a critical alert, actually wasn't, because we were able to understand that the volume of transactions was stayed the same. The volume of successful transactions, how things were decisioned, all stayed the same. And because we were looking at behavior. And so for example, we would look at, is customer X processing how they should be every 20 minutes throughout the day. And so we would have an alert that says, okay, customer X is now 50% below their typical baseline. And so we were able to investigate, and we were finding things we'd never seen before and didn't quite understand, because we were taking a completely different look at how do you understand your systems, and how do you and how do you how do you alert accordingly. And so it was just eye opening. I'll never forget, we were baselining heap memory with the Java systems, and we found there was a deployment where the deployment was bad, but didn't know it, because what happened was the application was working, but the way memory was deployed on the systems, instead of incrementally staying stable, was incrementally going up. And so we were able to avoid an outage because of the way we were doing monitoring. We understood that the memory wasn't going down, and so it was at 85% with the Java heap, and that we were able to then proactively do something about it. We would have seen that if we hadn't understood that that level of memory utilization wasn't normal.
That's neat that you said that, because you just dropped down to the second to the last bullet. As I
Right,
said, all this stuff is going to overlay each other. And, what is normal? That's kind of a tough thing to say, because,
right, right.
it's a very dynamic environment. So it's not like it's going to stay at this temperature or this CPU usage or this memory usage, because a lot of things constantly happen. And sometimes something's going to occur, let's call it an anomaly, but it's not broke. It's not bad. There's nothing necessarily wrong at that
Exactly.
point.
And also this year, so let's start about the business value. The business value of observability is that you can head off your major issues, because you have now your could be much more predictive and proactive. So our goal was, for example, we wanted to stop having major incident bridges. We wanted to have a lot of little bridges and a lot of little incidents, instead of a bunch of big incidents. And so by all these things that we're talking about, we were able to increase uptime. We were able to increase availability. We were also able, and one of the interesting things was, we were much better able to understand the capacity of the systems, and also understand per customer impact. An example, they think, for service management, you have 10,000 customers using an application. Understanding how every customer is impacted and every customer behavior is really, really tough to do. But by using these observability concepts, we were able to turn things on their head. We would have never in a month of Sundays been able to achieve this, but with typical static monitoring. And so so let's go. That's that business value. Is you're finding things you don't know about. You're going to increase your uptime. You're going to increase your availability. You're going to increase your customer satisfaction. And at the end of the day, that's what matters. Happy customers generate revenue. Unhappy customers don't. And
No,
so I mean
that
that's the thing.
makes perfect sense. And that's why I want to have this discussion with you, because, as I say, a lot of the papers out there, once again, they're not wrong or whatever, but they typically focus in different areas, and they get down in the weeds very, very quickly.
Right.
And it's like, why do I need observability? Well, it's going to save you 3.8%. That's not reality. And so that's kind of a good way to do that.
Right.
And it all comes back to the business value, whether it's
Exactly.
the experience, whether it's an SLA, an SLO, an SLI, whatever it happens to be, that's how you measure how successful you are. But that being so, let's kind of jump to the second one, because you kind of touched that on already. The different teams, we've got, when you and I both got in this network, you had the IT department,
Right.
and they pretty much did everything. And now you've got the IT department, and sometimes small departments, you have a lot of people that wear a lot of hats. And
Right.
other times you have very siloed AI ops, DevOps, SecOps, SRE, AI ops, and I'm quite sure there's some other ops out there. But how do they view it? And whether we're talking observability or telemetry data or security data, we're looking at data. So,
Right.
so we don't have to get hung up. But what are their challenges, or what are their different interests? Because my view is they're all looking at similar data sets. Yeah, there's kind of a Venn diagram involved in there, but they're looking at different data sets for different reasons. And what's kind of your view on that? Because what were you focused on like before in your previous customer side stuff? Were you a DevOps type guy or
Well, I mean, I help manage all the operational and security data for the company. So
perfect?
I was an everybody guy.
You
And
had lots of hats on your shelf.
but I looked. So we supported like the DevOps team. We supported all the teams. And so let's just give like from that DevOps point of view. One thing to find with observability is that you have a common set of principles, but how you apply those principles per application is a little different because it's about behavior. So, for example, you don't want to have the same set of rules around a batch application versus an online application. And so those are the things we did was is try to create a practice of, here's how you do this, here's how you implement it. So like one of the things we did so we work with each one of the application owners with the idea of we want to understand what are your golden signals. Everyone's golden signals are a little different. And so, for example, transaction time was very, very important. Volume was very, very important. And we have a few other things. But so that way we could establish a baseline of what's normal volume, what's normal transaction time, what's normal memory utilization. And the same thing for the network team. So the network team's looking for observability, for example, in their network tools. They're looking to understand, is my firewall doing what it's supposed to do? Are we blocking the right things? Are we allowing the right things through? And so we're looking at big gross trending of understanding of, what are we blocking? And also understanding, are we blocking an actual customer? And so for example, we're looking at MaxMine and trying to then understand and do enrichment with firewall logs against a white list of customers or allow list of customers. And so there's an example. So that's DevOps, the networking team, security team. So Insider Threat, for example, is looking at a baseline of employee swipe badges, like when employees actually went to an office anymore. So is the employee that works in Chicago now swiping the badge of the office in Hong Kong at 3 o'clock in the morning? And so because I mean those are the kind of things that happen, that you have a physical security compromise, and but also is someone logging in at a time that they don't normally log in, because that it may be just they're up late and they're working, but also it could just the idea of raising an eyebrow. And so those are four real clear examples of where observability principles can make a difference across the entire org. But does it make sense though in terms of it's you're basing on behavior, but how you implement it's going to be a little different depending on the use case. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense, and it just and sometimes, though, it seems like it can become overwhelming because we've gotten the ability now to capture so much data, and we
Right.
have so many different departments with so many different tools. And it's like, okay, I need everything, but I don't have the capability or the technology or maybe the budgets to look at everything. So, you've got this whole AI ops type thing that says, I'm
Mhm.
going to automate this whole thing. And whether we ever get there or not, or whether we ever get to Star Trek or whatever, it's kind of a different view of that, which kind of brings back to, another thing is that what is observability again? Is it a tool? Is it a concept? Is it a
No, it's not a
solution?
tool.
Is it a
It's
product?
it's concepts and principles. Now the product you pick may contribute to achieving that concept and principle, but it is not an observability by itself is not a tool.
The way I look at it, and
No.
once again, we don't necessarily always going to agree on anything. That's why you have discussions. Is
Hmm.
I kind of look at the idea of observability like security. I want to build a security solution. I can go buy a VPN. I can go buy a firewall, but I
Hmm.
have to build my security solution based on my specific needs.
Right.
If I'm a Fed company and I've got to have air gap type stuff, there's a whole totally different level of security I have
Sure.
versus a pizza shop that's giving out free Wi-Fi. So, how do you design how do you decide what how much observability is enough, if that's kind of a funny way to say that?
Well, I'm not sure you can have enough, but I think the thing is, so there's foundational aspects of it. So it's establishing the principles, establishing the concepts, and then also I found that creating the correct data sources is really important. So that's why, for example, like my team called it, we're going to support 4 or 5 golden signals, and that's it, because we can't support every golden signal. So you got to pick, per application or per whatever you're doing, the 4 or 5 things that matter, and then we're going to work from there. And so, for
That's a
example, like,
Go
go ahead.
ahead.
But just like, for example, application logs. Run an application log that doesn't have response time, because response time is a critical thing. For example, you got a customer who's interacting with you, and you can't measure response time. Nothing pisses customers off more than slow. So the idea, if your website's slow, they're going to go to someone else's website who's better. And so you got to understand that. Volume is another critical indicator. For example, you're looking at, you have a customer typically at, 4 o'clock in the day, their 10-minute average is 1,000 transactions per 10 minutes. And so and for example, think about observability. You don't necessarily care that instead of 1,000 transactions, that maybe they're at 10,000. You don't really care about that, but you care if they're at, say, 50. And so you have to have that ability to, set those rules in terms of what I care about.
That's interesting because, and that goes
Mhm.
back to what we talked about before is baselines, is that
Right.
there's not going to be, well, theoretically, depending on the data you're talking about, there could be a point on the wire that triggers something. But a lot of times it's actually going to be more of a range that,
Exactly.
it's networking. It's so dynamic and so, which actually kind of brings back to a question you mentioned. You said data. You said data several times. And I don't want to get into the whole data type thing, but if you think about it, in observability, any document you read, it's the three pillars: it's logs, metrics, and traces. But
Right.
what other things? If I'm trying to look at my environment and the different teams, what else are they looking at? I mean, config files is something that we are very important because if something happened, I might want to know that somebody just changed a config file on some system, you know, half a second before I had a failure somewhere else or I had an anomaly somewhere else. And how does that fit into the whole thing?
Well, I mean, there's a few things that, I mean, I think config files are good in terms of your response. Or is that a good thing in terms of, is this an indicator of a problem? I'm not sure. And so that's why you have to differentiate. And this is where I think there's a really good detection, good security analogy with, you have detection, then you have response. And typically that can be two different data sets and a little bit, it's a little bit of both. You need your detection data for the response, but you said, hey, something's wrong. And now you have a different set of data to understand, is something wrong? So yeah, the idea of, you know, you're tipped off by, the question, is something wrong? You answer the question of, then you use your response to answer that question. So I think, like, for example, config file information is a great way to answer that question. You have an outage, someone changed a config file, that's the root cause. You understand what that so, and that's where that classification of, detection versus response is so important.
I think what you just said was so important about
Mhm.
everything going on here because there is so many different things going on. It's not a straight line. Observability is not a straight line. It's not a
Mhm.
specific target. It's just there's so many things going on at so many different points with so many different types of data across so many different systems, across so many different teams
Yep.
that it's it's great and it's also immensely challenging if you don't set it up right, if you don't have, and it's all about policies, I guess, policies and procedures, because there's enough tools out there.
Right, and you also have to pick your tools, and, like, there's some better better options out there that I'm real enamored with, but you have to, it takes some dedication and focus. Now, we have a question, Mr. Manuel. So it's asked, how is the network security infrastructure designed to allow the implementation of a GRC framework to allow seamless observability of data? And so there's a few things here. So I just want to mention, especially in the rise of zero trust networks, for example. So then this is where I think for your network security, your the way your network is put together is so important. And so one of the things that so Perry, do you have any comments first, or do you want me to go ahead and
No,
answer
go
that?
for it on that.
So, and there's a couple of things that are really important, because the idea is that you want to have segmentation of your data, but you want to have segmentation of your networks, but you want to bring that data together to do something with it, because I think there's nothing worse than having silos of data that are disconnected. So the kind of things that I recommend, and this is where it's important. So let's say you have a customer network, you have a healthcare network, you have a, let's call it a financial services network. So the idea is that you have, say, an operational network in the middle that has legs into all three networks that are closely controlled. And so your telemetry data, like you mentioned, traces, logs, metrics, whatever, is going to go to border gateways that are strictly allowed from one segment to allow that data to go to another segment, but only through officially allowed components. So you have, for example, you have your standard agent, you have your standard aggregator, then your aggregator then brings that together into your standard analytics tool in the middle. So that way you're not poking thousands of holes through the firewall in order to get data to the right network. And so I think that's really important to have the capabilities of doing that. For example, this is something that makes my skin crawl when people talk about, hey, we're going to have the agent talk to my observability system across multiple segments. And so just, you have tens of thousands of agents, tens of thousands of holes through the firewall, tens of thousands of sessions, makes it impossible to track. And so having that using the zero trust concept of essentially a gateway to get from one to the other, I think is ideal for that, because that's going to give you that network. So it's going to help limit issues, help limit your blast radius, especially what happened over the weekend in Vegas. And so it's so important.
Yeah, that's a
Yeah,
big
tell me
deal.
about it. Yeah, so I mean but it's super important because you want to have the goals of limit your blast radius, manage your risk, but you also, like talking about observability, you have to bring your data together. If you can't get your data together, you're not going to be able to do these things we're talking about.
Okay, that's great. That's
Mhm.
fantastic. And we obviously want to keep within the time frame we have. But one of the questions I want to kind of finish up
Yeah.
with, or the end, is like the third bullet there. I was reading once again, reading a lot about this stuff, and starting reading this stuff
Oh, Perry, frozen.
money or whatever.
There you
What's
go.
your thought on that?
All right, so bullet point number 3.
Yeah.
So absolutely, you can monetize observability. It's a very easy thing to start justifying. So this is something I saw. So you look at a typical major incident bridge. A company could have 25 to 35 people on it. We're talking about senior network engineers, senior application people, each making a boatload of money, especially if you have leaders. And so every hour you spend on that is now costing you internally a lot of money. Then you also say that, okay, we've had all these people working at 2 o'clock in the morning. So now we lost them the next day too. And so you start looking at their salary for the next day, which is a whole bucket load of money. And then it's important to understand, and this is what I like to do, is per minute understand what that outage is costing you. And so is it in strictly in lost revenue? Is it in SLA payments to a customer? So that way you can measure the value of, we stop having major incident bridges. So no more 35 people on a call anymore at 2 o'clock in the morning. No, you're able to then, so that's a huge benefit. And so this is something that you can definitely do with a little bit of effort, because it's very important. Technical things are nice, but it's critically important to talk about business value. So why, because you have to answer business leaders and ask you a question. Why are we doing this? And why am I giving you money? Why am I giving you time to do this? So it's important to be able to understand that. And then you talk about, you have increased customer retention because you have increased customer retention because of you have better service quality. So I mean, I think that's very important to do. So I see Perry is coming back online. The one thing I also wanted to mention was toward the end is the goal of observability, quicker reaction or be proactive. And I don't want to say it's both, because one of the things you notice when you start looking at behavior is typically you're going to start seeing tremors in a system that are going to give you an indication of an issue. It's something you see a lot in analytics, where you'll start seeing flutters in terms of, like, if a customer response time starts going up, volume starts going down. It was amazing once you started looking at the data, where that was typically 15 to 20 minutes before things went really bad. And so that ability to then alert your NOC, alert your SOC in order to take action, say you're gonna have your EDR system isolate a device, and so that way you take that proactive approach, or you understand the server that's having this issue and you take it out of the load balancer. And so you can that's my point about having small issues instead of big issues, because it can really be something. So let's see, another question. All right. And I really appreciate it. Says here, let me show this off. So I really appreciate it. So yeah, and we're more than happy. So I really appreciate the questions. Keep that up. And as far as baselining, I think baselining is one way to do this. I mean, to me is when you look at analytics, it's tough to do. There's a lot of different modes of machine learning, and so that's why basic anomaly detection is typically the best to baseline and understanding what's weird. Because I remember talking to one of my senior cyber leaders that I used to work for, and he was like, "I don't care about denies on the firewall because that's on purpose. I want to know. I want to know about what's getting through." And that's why that baselining concept is so important. And but but it all comes back to data. So many of these things that start with the principles and the concepts, build up your data sets, and in order to then support the principles and concepts, and then you have your analytics tools available to then do this. So there are out of the box tools that do a nice job, really nice job at what we're talking about. But there's, some of them have some costs, and you have to understand it. Do you need to build them? Because that's typically where I see some struggles with the tools that have a nice out of the box experience, is the ability to customize them. This was one of the other things that I never thought about until my team got really deep into this, was business logic changes will change behavior. And so, for example, we had an application and they really changed the logic of how a particular customer was handled. And then it started showing up almost immediately, and then it threw off our baselines. And so you have to have a way to understand if our business logic changes being made that are going to throw off your baselines. That way you have to essentially rebalance the baseline in order for it to make sense. So I think Perry has gone offline in the great lines of Chattanooga. So I just want to have a little bit of announcement. We're going to have a series. So we're going to talk about business and technical requirements soon. We're going to talk about components and tools. We're going to offer about benefits of data pipelines, also observability search tools. And so just the idea, we're going to have a broad overview. Let's see, can the observability systems be deployed on both host and client-based systems? So another good question. And so typically observability systems are where you bring the data to. And so you're going to have client-based and host-based systems generate the telemetry that you then send to your observability systems. And so I just want to make sure that hopefully that makes sense, where your systems are what generate or what going to generate the data, and your observability systems are what's going to make sense out of it. And so, and hopefully that makes sense. So then we'll be talking about these things. We're going to try to bring it together, just give a broad sense of what is observability, and frankly, why do I care? Because I think that's also important to ask. I mean, you don't want to spend your time in any business basically just doing a science project. There's Perry. I see him.
Sorry about that. Can you hear me?
There's Perry. There we go.
Thanks for covering for me. The Chattanooga here, they promised me a gig, synchronous. For whatever reason, didn't happen. So once again, great for covering for me. I guess you starting talking about this whole series is a 10 module series, and typically they're shorter little modules, and you can kind of see them there. Ed, I really appreciate you joining today, and especially covering for me for the last 6 or 7 minutes.
It's okay.
But
I think this is a great conversation. And the thing is, this isn't about tools. This is about concepts, and just help people understand that value, and just give them some examples. I mean, it's great.
And the bottom line here, too, is observability. Everybody's already using it. Everybody's got a component of it in their network. If you're monitoring anything, if you got a syslog server, you've got at least some level of that. So once again, lots of stuff. We're trying to keep this whole thing, and as you saw here, very agnostic, very vendor neutral. It's just challenges people are seeing and potential solutions, some best practices. But thanks again. I really appreciate your time, and we'll be back on these again in the coming weeks.
Look forward to it soon. Take care, Perry. I'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, Ed. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye. And for everyone out there and our listeners, we really appreciate your time, and we look forward to keeping up the conversation. Please give us all the questions you have in the chat. Thank you, and have a good day.
Yeah, reach out with the tough ones.